The following episode contains descriptions of abuse, sexual assault, and homicidal violence. Listener discretion is advised.
King County detectives are now forming a task force to investigate the murders. They have no suspect, no motive, and very little evidence.
Women are being killed. The issues aren't being addressed because the women are prostitutes.
So once again, there is speculation that investigators are back to square one.
I didn't think they were doing enough. I thought, if this was a policeman's daughter, they would find somebody.
He doesn't remember faces or names. In most cases, there might be a couple of them. The thing that he remembers is where he put them so he could go back and have power and control one more time.
It hit me again just how many people this man had killed. It was as if he had committed an act of genocide.
You've made it difficult to live up to what I believe, and that is what God says to do, and that's to forgive. And he doesn't say to forgive just certain people, he says to forgive all. So you are forgiven, sir.
There are nearly 20,000 murders annually in the United States. Perhaps it's the weather, but the Pacific Northwest has become the notorious home of serial killers and bizarre crimes. We're here to discuss those murders, to try to understand the motives, respect and remember the victims,
and explore the humanity of it all.
I'm Emily Rowney.
And I'm Alicia Holland.
And this is Murder in the Rain. Hi guys, as usual, we're going to have our regular scheduled retelling of another weirdo murderer in the Pacific Northwest. But today, we have two special guests, some real-life professionals joining us after the case to discuss all things psycho. Dr. Bricado is a clinical psychologist who specializes in violence and psychosis, and his colleague Dr. Stone is a legendary forensic psychiatrist who has penned hundreds of articles on personality disorders and has personally interviewed dozens of murderers. So guys, stick around after today's famous case to meet the docs.
Most importantly, we know him from the TV.
Davey!
He's got his own show, Most Evil, on Investigation Discovery.
In July 1982, two children riding their bikes near a local river outside Seattle made a terrifying discovery: the nude body of a 16-year-old runaway named Wendy Lee Caulfield. Wendy had been strangled with her own clothing and her body disposed of in the river. This is when the proverbial floodgates opened, and by August, 4 more bodies of young women were discovered in or around the same waters. That summer, it was clear that a new serial killer was stalking the Pacific Northwest. His modus operandi was to pick up a runaway or prostitute, lull them to trust him with images of his son, and once they were comfortable, he would rape and strangle them to death. Victims were often found in clusters, meaning if you found one, you were soon to find more. The first cluster was found dumped in a local river, giving the killer his notorious moniker. Today, we're discussing the Green River Killer, one of the most prolific serial killers in the United States. The vast majority of the Green River Killer's murders took place in surrounding areas of Seattle, Washington. Most bodies were dumped in remote wooded areas, and the bodies sometimes appeared posed in a tableau, and most often found nude. One witness who discovered 2 of the victims mentioned that he thought the bodies he saw weighted down in the water were mannequins. But we always know they're never mannequins.
He found them at the same time, right?
Yeah.
He didn't happen
No.
1 week and then, guys, found another.
No, he was on the river.
I see.
And he found 2. As the first few bodies were found and the tension in the Seattle area was at an all-time high, a cabbie named Melvin Foster stepped forward to offer his assistance to police. You see, Melvin heard the names of the victims and claimed to know 5 of the women. As a taxi driver in the late hours of the night, he said he frequently interacted with these women and that he even offered them free rides, a space to warm up from the cold, meals, and even rent money from time to time. Police initially had a strong suspicion of Melvin.
I have one.
He did fit their description of a killer. So he's a white guy. He's in his early 30s or early 40s. So he's like 30 to 40 range, and he's definitely a loner. So they put round-the-clock surveillance on him right away, and I think it lasted for a few months. Police were wrong, though. Melvin didn't do it. He was literally just an awkward kind of individual who made the mistake of offering his help.
A graveyard shift taxi
Wanted
driver.
someone to talk to. You can go on YouTube and see a ton of interviews with him and the local news anchors. We know now they were wrong for a number of reasons. Firstly, the surveillance they had on him all the time. So cops are tracking his every move, but the murders continued. So it was clear he was not committing them. And while no one was sure who the killer was, there was a lot of evidence left behind. The evidence ranged from obscure paint chips on victims' bodies, hair and clothing, to semen and other DNA. Melvin offered his DNA swab, and the investigators tested it and ultimately ruled him out because there was no match. The deluge of body discoveries continued into 1983. 9 more deceased women were located. In 1984, the count increased drastically after another 13 more dead women were located. While victims still succumbed to strangulation, it seemed the killer graduated from manual strangulation to using ligatures. Most victims were now found in wooded areas rather than the early discoveries in the river. With this rapid increase in bodies, the King County Sheriff's Office formed the Green River Task Force, which included Robert Keppel and Dave Richard, who had ties to the Ted Bundy investigation. Investigators turned to new sources of information to try to help solve this case. Ted Bundy, one of the most recognizable serial killers of all time, played an interesting role in this case. Bundy, who was renowned for his interactions with investigators because he clearly loved attention. So the task force used that to their advantage to get the professionals' take on the Green River killer.
And at this time, he's on death row.
Yeah.
Right? Okay.
So he's regularly interacting with investigators.
And it's my understanding this is the inspiration for, or part of the inspiration for Silence of the Lambs, where it's using the killer
to help
to catch a killer.
Solve another, yeah. Bundy suggested to the investigators that they should stake out one of the sites that a recent dead body was located at. He thought that the killer would return to the site and that he was having sex with the dead victims. And this is something Ted Bundy was quite familiar with, so what we find out later is he was in fact right. The crime scenes proved to become confusing and misleading over time. There were items like chewing gum and cigarettes scattered around the sites, and these were coming from different DNA sources. This was identified as a specific choice to mislead the investigators.
Kind of clever.
It really is.
Because not only is it getting them off of your trail, but then they're wasting their resources on all these other
Yeah, I mean, you think about when, police come to a crime scene and they're like, oh, you can't step here, or you're picking this up, and they're contaminating their own crime scenes. He's basically doing this before the police even get to it, and just making it so confusing that they take even longer to figure out something.
Yeah.
So like I said earlier, the manual strangulation moved to the use of ligatures. And these range from fishing line, clothing and neckties, ropes and cords. And we're not sure if the killer was doing that to just grab something nearby or if that was purposeful to also try to mislead the investigators. The bodies are often posed or mutilated, items left in orifices, and one victim even decapitated. Carol Christensen, a victim discovered May in 1983, was posed in a sick tableau. Police found her body in a wooded area in Maple Valley, Washington. She had been strangled with fishing line and posed on her back with a paper sack over her head, a trout placed on her neck and shoulder, and a bottle of wine on her stomach. Next to her, a mound of sausage. Pretty weird, right?
Wow.
So there's speculation by some that this is supposed to represent a reference to the Last Supper, but a lot of people think, no, they were just doing something to mock the police.
Yeah. So my question is, and I don't know if you know the answer, was the only connecting part the location and that they were all strangled? Because it sounds like everyone kind of had a little bit of a different, all the victims had a little bit of a twist as far as like being in the water, being out of the water, being sort of mutilated, being
so
not.
Overall, there's 49 confirmed victims.
Wow.
Only 5 of those were found in the Green River.
Okay.
So that was the very first cluster. Everything else from there is in the woods.
Okay.
But the crimes themselves are so similar, even though they were using different ligatures, it's still very obviously the same person.
Okay.
Later in 1983, investigators had a suspect named Gary Ridgway. They were able to connect him with several of the victims. Ridgway had originally been arrested in 1982 for solicitation, but he was never a suspect at that time. The first connection was to Marie Melbar. She was missing, and her family had noted that the last time she was seen, it was in a truck that looked very similar to Ridgway's.
Did they say what initially made him a suspect back when they first started looking at him?
I think it was just that he had frequented a lot of the prostitutes in the area, and they started recognizing him and talking about all the people that come by.
Okay.
And it's two of those women go missing, the ones I referenced there. He looks like one of them. His car looks like one of them,
Okay.
and they're starting to piece it
So
together.
he ended up on the list that was probably fairly long.
And you
but
know, I
he's
never
there.
really found an article that specifically said how many people they were looking at. Really, it's just these two people were ever identified.
Okay. And then why did it take that long?
I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that there was two task force. So originally in 1982, they had a task force.
Okay.
They had a really hard time finding anyone. After they saw that taxi driver wasn't the person of interest, they didn't have anyone. They were wasting millions of dollars, so they disbanded.
Okay.
Then as they get new bodies in 1984, there's 13 or so, they get that task force back together and start looking again. So it's just kind of interesting that it maybe slips through the cracks when different investigators come
Which is
on.
bizarre because if you have an actual task force assigned to one crime or one
And it was
killer.
lots of people. It's not just like 5 investigators.
Right. And so you have this whole force. You would think that it's like, hey, we have DNA finally for this one case that requires an entire force of people, but we're just going to sit on it for how many years
it's
total?
so weird. And it makes you think, well, I think it was 14 total till they get him, right? But let's think about it for a second. You have one or two main people of interest and you can't run a DNA check really quick.
Right.
When you have all this DNA. It's very interesting. I wonder if somebody didn't get the memo, like they put it through and forgot to follow up, or
After they took his DNA and they have him as the suspect, how many women were found to be victims of him before the DNA was run? Because if I'm a family member and I find out that they have a suspect and it matches, you know, a description as a person and a vehicle, and then we also have DNA, but then we're sitting there and then I lose a family member in that time frame, I'm really not going to be happy.
the thing with Gary Ridgway is the majority of his victims happened between 1982 and 1984. There are very few victims after that. Now they found, I think 10 or so after his arrest, since 1987. However, the bulk of that killing was all done early. So and we'll talk about this in a minute, but he had a marriage he describes as quite happy. And during that time, he didn't feel the urge to kill as often. So I don't think the families are going to hold the people accountable for it. It's
Right.
still just a little weird to me that it would take that many years to run a DNA sample.
Yeah.
Particularly on a high profile case. It's not just like one of the hundreds of rapes that are sitting in the
Right.
back room. It took 14 years and many deaths, but Gary Ridgway was finally behind bars. To avoid the death penalty, Ridgway pled guilty to 48 counts of murder. And during that agreement, he decided he would tell investigators the story of what he did and also help them locate all of the victims. Right after he pled guilty to 48, they found one more victim and added a 49th sentence. Gary Leon Ridgway was born February 18th, 1949 in Salt Lake City, Utah. He was the least favorite child of 3 sons born to Thomas and Mary Ridgway. There seems to be a norm in the serial killer world, and that is white men with major mommy issues, and that is definitely the case here. His home life was troubled, and relatives agree that Mary was really domineering, and there was often violent arguing between his parents. And at one point, the mother is described in a police report having broken a big plate over his father's head.
Wow.
Gary's father was a bus driver, and get this, part-time mortuary worker. And he often complained about sex workers, and he even told Gary stories about a coworker at the mortuary that was a necrophiliac and that he really took advantage of job perks. So Gary had what we call, tells for a serial killer. He was a bedwetter, and he did that well into being 13 years old. And he claims that his mother would kind of make a scene about it. She would get him up, put him in front of his brothers and talk about it. And she would refuse to let him take a shower and deal with it himself. It's like she was washing him herself. And oftentimes it was wearing, revealing clothing. So Gary says that this made him confused. He had angry feelings toward his mother, but also sexual feelings. And that caused a kind of a rage within him where he says he fantasized about killing her. I mean, ultimate Oedipus complex, right?
Yeah.
At age 16, now this is when we see these small signs kind of hint at a future career in doing something more. He actually lured a 6-year-old boy into the woods and he stabbed him through the ribs. And as the boy lies on the ground, at the time he thinks he's dying, but he ends up surviving, thank God. But as he's dying, he says, "Why did you do that?" Gary Ridgway kind of laughs, walks away and says, "I always wanted to know what it was like to kill someone."
And how old is he?
16.
And did anything come from that legal
No.
wise?
I think he maybe got a slap on the wrist. Is that the saying? Slap on the wrist.
Yeah. So that probably also embedded in him this idea of
Power trip.
invincibility.
Yeah.
And look how, that kid lived through it and I got away with it.
Absolutely. Gary had 2 failed marriages. He married his first wife directly out of high school and went to the Navy, ultimately ending up in Vietnam. During that marriage, both parties had kind of stepped out on each other. Gary was frequenting prostitutes in Vietnam, and his wife actually had an emotional affair back here in the U.S. So this really infuriated him. Even though they were both doing, similar activities, he automatically called her a whore, and he got very angry. And I think that's where we see his hatred of his mother kind of expanding into hating women in general. He also ended up with gonorrhea from Vietnam. Again, another reason to blame a sex worker for something bad happening to him. He eventually married a second time, and with this wife, he had a son, and his son definitely became one of the most important people in his life. But he also used his son as a pawn to manipulate the women that he would eventually murder. And I talked about that in the introduction, where he would often show a picture of his son to prostitutes and cover his address up with his thumb, just so they would get comfortable with him and get in the car and think, oh, he's a family man. We're just going to, have a good time. I'm going to get paid and go on with my life. But in reality, he was doing that on purpose to make them more pliable and easier to murder. He even talks about he would leave toys in his car. I think in one case, he actually had his son with him with a prostitute in the car. So he was very comfortable doing this. Yet, if you go back and listen to the tapes, his son actually had no idea his dad was doing this.
Wow.
During his second marriage, his wife described him as really having an obscenely insatiable sex drive, often asking her to have sex with him 7 to 8 times a day. Jeez. He would try to get her to have sex with him in public places, a lot of times in the woods, and these ended up being places where he was dumping bodies. So there was definitely some overlap where he was likely having sex with his wife while a rotting corpse was nearby, likely helping him achieve his needs.
Right, because he's also still going back to that same spot and committing necrophilia.
He is, yeah.
Before bringing his wife. Very romantic.
It really is. So he ends up moving on and marrying a third wife, which is described as a happy marriage. He stops killing as much. And in an interview with his third wife, she makes a comment like, "I saved lives. Our happiness in our marriage helped less murder." Yeah, it's just so disturbing. So talk about a couple of narcissists,
honestly.
Right?
Sorry, I'm such a hero.
I know. So when you sit down and read this guy's life story, you think, I have to think his childhood really helped mold who he eventually ended up being. He's raping and murdering sex workers, returning to rape their corpses, often until their remains were too decomposed to even have sex with it.
Well, not to mention the PTSD of Vietnam itself. You're coming in already with a background of violence and sexual confusion and all of that, and then throw in the Vietnam War and PTSD and everything else, and it's a recipe for disaster for sure.
And it's interesting that people will sit down and talk to him. You can go on YouTube and find tons of videos of him being interviewed. He talks about very minute details about his murders, his mother, just nonchalantly, like, yeah, I used to watch my mom sunbathe, and think about having sex with her and I want her to teach me how to have sex. Yet he won't talk about Vietnam. So you got to think maybe it started there. Maybe his actual first murder was there.
Yeah. Well, and it was again, so you have the kid in the woods that he, got away with assaulting. And then you have, not only are you getting away with murder, you're being paid to go commit murder, but it's okay. It's this war setting.
How do you separate
and it's
it?
violent and aggressive, and you're doing it to protect yourself. And it's like, while you're getting prostitutes, it's like all the wires are crossed.
Yeah. Gary Ridgway has a tendency to be a narcissist. In interviews, you can hear him explain that he was doing the police a favor. So it was his belief that the prostitution problem in Seattle was so out of control that the police could not handle it. So it was his duty to step in and take care of it.
Yeah, that sounds like a narcissistic
It is,
personality
right?
disorder.
But also, you think back to his childhood, his dad, the bus driver, was always going on and on about these sex workers. So it's almost like he's mirroring his father.
Right, or like a hero to him.
I don't really think we're ever going to know how many victims died at the hands of Gary Ridgway. While he's incarcerated for the deaths of the 49 confirmed women, he claims he's killed an upwards of 71. And some people believe the number is closer to 100. And the reason being is there are a lot of missing prostitutes and runaways that fit the bill. But we just won't ever know because by now, if they were well hidden in the woods, it's very unlikely we're going to see some of these bones turn up. So many people were impacted by the selfish existence of Gary Ridgway. And I'd like to take a moment just to acknowledge the victims and their families. Many of these ladies were kind of adrift in life and were never going to know how they could have truly contributed to the world because he erased them off the timeline. There was a local nonprofit, and they worked tirelessly for a couple of years to try to get $250,000 to create a permanent memorial for the victims in Seattle. Yeah, unfortunately, they made about $12,000 and it ended. Kept trying to get to the website and it's just gone. So
that's too bad.
It makes me really sad in that sense. But there is an artist I found online, and this is really cool. So this artist's name is Phil Hansen, and he created this artwork of a picture of Gary Ridgway. But if you look at it closely, it's just images of all the women he killed.
Wow.
So I have that up on the website with his website, so you can go look at it. Lucky for us, Gary Ridgway was caught, and he's spending his remaining years in the Washington State Penitentiary in Walla Walla, Washington. Also, lucky for us, today we have some real professionals on the line with us, and I'm itching to find out what they have to say about this pile of human garbage.
Absolutely.
Welcome, Doctors Gary Bricado and Michael Stone, to Murder in the Rain. We're very excited to have such royalty on the show. Yes. For listeners who might not know you, I'd love to take a moment to just brag a little bit and hopefully elevate the credentials of our podcast so we look legitimate. So Dr. Bricado, you and I struck up a friendship on Instagram, so slide into DMs does work.
Yes.
Tell us a little bit about yourself and what drew you to the topic we're talking about today.
As you say, my name is Dr. Gary Bricado. I'm the assistant director of the Center of Prevention and Evaluation, which is a research clinic at Columbia Medical Center at the New York State Psychiatric Institute. We do research there with young people who are experiencing early signs of psychosis, and we're examining how that might be related to violence. We have a grant from the National Institute of Mental Health to look at that over some years. And I also do evaluations within the college system here in New York City for people who have gotten into trouble for violence or other reasons which make it sort of complicated. I do this research and this writing with Dr. Stone, and I was drawn to that, throughout my work, originally because I wanted to know what distinguished psychotic violence from violence that was associated with people that really wouldn't stand out too much at first glance from the rest of us. In order to do those evaluations more appropriately, I got more and more interested in the question of severe personality disorders, and that drew me, of course, to Dr. Stone's work. He had been a hero of mine for quite a long time. I got interested in writing a book. I spoke to a colleague at work, and I said, you've got to talk to Michael Stone. You two will be like two peas in a pod. You've got to get together. And when we did, we, was sort of like a kismet of people that I think, really authentically are interested in this stuff, and it, and then I had the honor of writing a book with someone whose work has always meant a lot to me. Maybe Dr. Stone wants to tell you a little bit about his background.
Yeah, absolutely. So, Dr. Stone, here's what we know about you, because you're pretty famous around here. We know you're a forensic psychiatrist. You've published multiple books, over 200 articles on, I think, mainly personality disorders. But we know you from Most Evil on Discovery Channel. That's something I'm really interested in, where you are looking at criminals and cases and categorizing them on your scale. So I'd love to hear about, your background and how you created the scale.
I was, of course, interested during my days at Psychiatric Institute in Columbia in borderline personality disorder, which was the main personality disorder of the patients that came to our special unit for psychotherapy back in the 60s and 70s. But then, as I got to be known as somebody who understood personality disorders, including borderline, I would be asked occasionally by attorneys to evaluate one side or the other of some court battle, where, especially like in a custody case where one member of the family or the married couple was considered borderline, and attorneys for the other side maybe felt that was not accurate, so I would be called in, to make a judgment. I got interested as a result of all that in the extremes of personality, which would then shade over beyond borderline into antisocial and psychopathy and sadism. So I got interested in the forensic work, and actually, for 20 years worked in forensic hospitals. And then I was called in the 80s to Los Angeles to be at a court trial where the fellow who had killed his pregnant wife and two daughters, Jeff McDonald, initially McDonald was acquitted. But there was a second trial not long after where more evidence was found that made it very clear that he was indeed the killer of his wife and his two little daughters. So that was what the trial was about. But meantime, I was out there sitting maybe just 15 feet from him with those 1,000-yard stare eyes that many psychopaths have that burn a hole right through you. And I wanted the jury at least to be acquainted with, well, where does this murder of the pregnant wife and two kids fit if you were to imagine a spectrum or a scale of awfulness. The worst person that I thought of was Ian Brady in England, who, with his sidekick Myra Hindley, would use Myra to lure children to a very remote college in the moors of England, a very empty area in England, and then Ian would strangle the children and record their screams on a tape recorder, which he used as a sort of a sexual turn-on, if you can believe it. I thought, well, it can hardly be any worse than that. So that would be the top of whatever scale I was going to create. On the opposite end would be, first of all, justified homicide, which is not evil at all. But then I use that as my anchor point. That was I call it gradation 1, ultimately. And then next to that is crimes of passion. If you were making a scale of evil or awfulness or heinousness, that's on the low end, where torture murder is very much at the high end.
Right.
When I was talking in Los Angeles at the trial, I only knew of maybe a half dozen of these kinds of cases, so that I just said that Jeffrey McDonald fits somewhere in the middle. He didn't torture his wife and children. It wasn't at the awfulest extreme of evil, but by no means was it justified homicide or a crime of passion. So he was like somewhere in the middle. And then from that point, I got very much fascinated in the whole topic, and even then began working full-time at a forensic hospital that was connected with Columbia, and saw mentally ill people who had done various crimes, including murder, arson, and other sorts of assaults and things of that sort, and began to shift the nature of my writing a little bit away from just borderline personality and other personality disorders onto antisocial and psychopaths and sadists. I've written a number of articles on sadism, which then got picked up by Ben Carey at the New York Times, who's a wonderful journalist. He had written about my thoughts about evil, which is a topic that was hardly ever spoken of in psychiatry because it has to do with more with our moral judgments and our reaction rather than a personality disorder that's in our manual. But the Discovery Channel picked it up, and they invited me then to go around the country interviewing these various kinds of killers. I suggested ones that I thought would be interesting, to interview, and they sent letters to the person and to the warden. Both people had to agree, to be interviewed, and then they sent me around Montana to California to Georgia, Texas, interviewing mass murderers, serial killers, and various other kinds of people committing very serious crimes. That became the basis, for my Anatomy of Evil book that came out in 2009, where I referred, to some of the cases that I had personally interviewed, which would include Tommy Lynn Sells, and other cases that I had read about in these true crime books along the way.
So when you, before you did the show, had you published your scale in its entirety, or was that when the book Anatomy of Evil came out?
I think I only published the scale for the first time in the book in 2009. I was working on it and trying to make the scale where each step was a little bit more awful than the step before. And then the first, as Dr. Picado has amplified, my work on it, and has in many ways found more facts and data about some of the serial killers in particular than I had known. But at all events, the first few steps of maybe let's say from 2 to 8 or 9 are people with not much at all in the way of psychopathic traits. They're really not psychopaths. They may be antisocial, or they may be just people in a state of rage, committed a murder like the crimes of passion, but who are not really psychopaths. But then on the higher numbers, refer to people who would have a high score on the Hare psychopathy checklist developed by Robert Hare and his colleagues in Vancouver, and it's used more widely in the court and elsewhere in evaluating whether a criminal is or is not a psychopath. Point being, if the courts were really paying attention and really responsible, to what people like Dr. Picado and I know about psychopathy, they would know that the likelihood of rehabilitation is very, very close to zero. And therefore, if you have a murderer who's being arrested, tried, and convicted, and is not a psychopath, well, given certain circumstances, that person might be capable, ultimately, after some years or whatever, of rehabilitation and release into society as a person living an acceptable life among the citizenry. But if the person is clearly a psychopath, that would be a throw away the key phenomenon.
So let me ask you something. The hair scale is pretty, or the checklist, I guess, is what it is. There are a lot of people that identify as psychopaths, but they don't ever commit murder. What do you think, in your opinion, puts people over the edge? Is it a variety of factors? I know a lot of these serial killers have, family issues, hit on the head. What, in your guys' opinion, do you think sets these people apart?
Some of them come from very violent backgrounds, or some of them have been misused terribly, where the level of animosity, toward the human race or to certain people is much greater than the average person would ever experience, and that may push them over the edge. Some people are really born with areas of the brain that are supposed to serve in our frontal lobes as a kind of a braking system, and they have a deficiency of the braking system, if you will, so that all of us at one time or another are offended by somebody. We've been someone has smashed into our car carelessly and on the road. Somebody has gypped us in a store, whatever. A relative has hurt our feelings. And we have a momentary thought, I would like to kill the SOB.
Alicia's nodding.
Yes, that was me. I was like, that's where I fall on the scale, is driving home.
I don't think there's anybody that's absolutely free ever of having a wish to kill somebody. But the people who are the psychopaths who have that braking system not functioning, they may, by golly, go ahead and do it.
And it's important because the word psychopathy is sort of, you have to remember that when we speak in the world of forensics about psychopathy, many people will divide it up into what's called primary versus secondary psychopathy. When we say primary psychopathy, what we're really talking about is somebody where we're talking about hereditary factors, that may predispose somebody to these, perhaps boredom, sensation seeking, guiltlessness, gauging rewards and appropriate behavior, appropriately. And then what happens is that there are other people who have secondary psychopathy, which is where they're so horrendously treated, they've experienced so much adverse treatment across their lifetime that they walk away with a sort of total hatred of humanity that can mimic primary psychopathy. But the idea is that some people believe that you need both. There are some people who say, well, you've got to have a brain that's predisposed a certain way, but if you are treated well, you might take that brain that is sensation-seeking and kind of fearless and so forth and become something pro-social. You might be somebody who is willing to dash into fires or break up fights or battle criminals or so forth. But with the adverse treatment then pushing somebody over the edge, they may then apply that fearlessness and that sensation seeking toward something that is nefarious. But it's unclear. It's also, getting back to the braking system point, it's also interesting when you think about, the adolescent brain, and we think about some of the mass shooters and people, school age and college age shooters, and so when you think about things that override that braking system and at an age when it's particularly vulnerable. And we also, we think about the role of alcohol and drugs, which figure heavily into a lot of these cases. And Dr. Stone and I examined hundreds of these cases, and there are these sort of factors that conspicuously crop up over and over again. Using drugs, using alcohol, being abused by parents. Parents who were drinkers, parents sexually abused you. Exposure to sexual violence from a young age, and so it's very difficult to imagine that somebody could become a murderous psychopath without that background, and yet some of them do exist. Correct, Dr. Stone? We have examined some very peculiar cases of people that don't have a background that seems to make much sense.
Yes, I mean, as you were alluding to a moment ago, that Thomas himself came from a really horrifying background that was easily conduced to becoming a secondary psychopath. But Ted Bundy, although he had a violent grandfather who may even have been his father by incest, his mother carted him out to Washington when escaping her father. When Ted Bundy was 2, then her husband Bundy became his dad, more or less, and he was a working class person who was kindly and never laid a hand on him. No one, in other words, spanked him unduly. Nobody humiliated him while he was growing up. Nobody physically abused him, and it also didn't fall on his head. A lot of these people have had head injuries that have lowered their braking system ability, but he didn't have any of those. So he was one of the few in my collection of serial killers who seems to be the inherited kind, and he began to murder even when he was a teenager.
What complicates things a little bit also is that, we both, I think, have learned from experience that these people will sometimes also lie about their childhood experiences. And I think, one of the kind of the part of the essence of the kind of narcissistic, egocentric core of some of these people is that they will blame external forces. Ted Bundy, for instance, would weep talking about, the role of pornography in causing him to become violent. But if you watch video footage of that, you'll see that in the corner of his eye, with his crocodile tears, he's sort of looking at the interviewer for a reaction to see if he is, pulling for some sympathy from this person. And, it raises the question of whether, some of those antecedents that are described are manufactured by somebody who's pulling for sympathy, and you'd be amazed at the sob stories that I've been given by people, and then you find out from collateral information that they were entirely concocted. So so that's I think that makes things a lot harder when you're looking for the background story, for these people. So I'm sorry, I think you were.
Oh, I was just going to ask, that's interesting, the primary and secondary, how that plays into kind of the idea of nature and nurture. We also spoke about, I don't know if you know anything about the Ward Weaver case that we had here in Portland. We talked a little bit about generational trauma and how that's kind
About
of
genetics.
starting to come to the forefront of conversation a little bit more, as far as, maybe something doesn't happen, but because this trauma is carried through the family. Is that something you guys have looked at or experienced or have any thoughts on?
Right, and how a family that is, repeatedly, each member of the family has sort of been through some kind of horrendous adverse experience, and it's getting passed down, and
Yeah, or even if it skips that generation.
like some sort of environmental effect upon the
Hmm.
genetics of a person.
Yeah.
It's interesting, Dr. Stone, because I think it gets us into the question of the kind of evolutionary kind of purpose for some of what might be lingering in people who still commit these crimes. I guess it gets to the question of was it adaptive? Once upon a time, to have some of these features, this fearlessness and this sensation seeking and this violence and so forth, particularly in males.
The folks that we're talking about, in addition, to the callousness or the lack of remorse, have some of these other qualities that make it very difficult for them, to find any kind of a proper spot in society that is not offensive. I mean, the maybe the least offensive from a standpoint of violence psychopath would be like Madoff, somebody who never laid a violent hand on anybody, but built billions from unsuspecting investors, and therefore ruined the lives of many, many people, including even causing a few over in France to commit suicide, and I think his own son.
From having interviewed people who experienced, abuse, had parents who experienced abuse, there's alcoholism in the home, drug use, etc., that there are many people, in the psychopathic spectrum, the antisocial spectrum, the psychopathic spectrum, who will describe having become callous and shut off and sort of sadistic and so forth as feeling very adaptive to them, as feeling like it was necessary to become hardened that way to survive their environment. But what's interesting is how different that is from somebody that, from cradle to grave, demonstrates these proclivities regardless of their environment. I think when you're talking about the intergenerational situation, I think more often than not, what we're looking at is, it's a little complicated, but because we don't have too many, cases of someone who's a psychopath and then has a child who's a psychopath and has a child who's. It does seem that when things pass like that through families, it's because there's been some terrible traumatic experience, and then the next generation is exposed to similar factors and so forth, so that there's a kind of a teaching of, it would be adaptive to be a little cold, a little suspicious, a little shut off, a little, but I think there are cases, for example, Dr. Stone, am I correct that Ted Bundy, for instance, sired a child during a conjugal visit, correct? The same thing with John Wayne Gacy, correct? Right,
Yeah.
and we don't know, about their children because they're hidden from the public, and as a consequence, they can't really be studied. But it would be, it's an interesting thing to think about: do these traits pass on, genetically? But I think the answer is we don't know that much. But we understand that they must be hereditary because of the presence from early, that they basically seem to be inborn.
Right.
But Dr. Stone, am I correct that Tommy Linsells, who I think is one of the most fascinating in a lot of ways people we wrote about, am I correct that Tommy Linsells, really from the time he was a young kid, and he was sort of sexually disinhibited and inappropriate and so forth with his mother? Remember, he got into the shower with his mother and
In bed with his grandma.
case is a little bit complicated because he had meningitis, but then he was shunted over by his mom to his aunt, Bonnie Walpole. She shunted him over to a pedophile, Willie Clark, who molested him for a number of years until he finally escaped when he was 14. That seemed to, in other words, the horrible childhood. I mean, you could hardly imagine a worse childhood than Tommy Lynn Sells' and that set him on his path, to go all over, become a drifter and go all over the country, killing. When you see, I think he did his first murder in his mid-teens. In his case, we don't know really, at least I don't know, what his father William Sells was like at all. There's hardly any information about him. But even the people that were involved with him, his own mother and his aunt, were very dismissive, terrible parents. Just the sheer deprivation and unconcern and molestation that he suffered would make him a good candidate, for the concept that you were mentioning about secondary psychopathy, even if he did not have too much in the way of an inherited predisposition, to callousness.
And one of the qualities that Tommy Lynn Sells, I think, had in common with Gary Ridgway, and I know somebody that you wanted to speak about, that I was very struck by, is that both men had a kind of a capacity for compartmentalization, for splitting, where in Tommy Lynn Sells, despite his bloodlust and this ability to just sort of go out and just bludgeon people to death, shoot people to death, cut them up, men, women, children, whole families, with, no more compunction than you would have, crushing an insect. Despite that, he was able to form, a very loving, appropriate relationship with his bail bondswoman, correct, Dr. Stone, wasn't it? She became something of a mother figure to him, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. He was charming and pleasant even during my interview with him when he was on death row. I mentioned to many people, I think it was also in the book, that my first impulse before I met him as the television crews, coming up to the prison where we were to interview him, since I had read books about him, I thought, well, I feel like killing this guy. So then when you do interviews in death row through a telephone, because there's 3 inches of glass between you and the inmate. So I said, well, Tommy, I guess I got these 3 inches of glass, so I don't kill you and you don't kill me. And he says, you got that right? And he had a certain humor about him. Then toward the end, he said, I asked him about this remorse. He says, well, looking back, I do feel a little bit of remorse, but if I felt full remorse, I'd have to kill myself. That was kind of an insight for this not very bright fellow who realized that he'd done terrible things, and if he really felt the kind of compassion that people are supposed to feel, that he'd have to kill himself rather than the state doing it.
It's interesting, the way that people like that can respond to somebody, because, with this kind of splitting, which is an important mechanism, I think, to understand when we talk about Gary Ridgway. I mean, Gary Ridgway, who was, wild during, he had 3 marriages. He had 1 marriage during which he committed virtually no murder because he felt that, he was with a very loving woman. He committed only 3 during the last one. But all throughout, I mean, he was committing, potentially as many as 70 murders of prostitutes, and also had a sort of a double life as a very religious person who, portrayed himself as so devout that he was weeping when reading the Bible and so forth, and then would sometimes in the same period would be going out killing prostitutes and runaways, and I think we really have to sort of get into that topic of that, the way that people can compartmentalize that way, to really, I think, get into personality disorder and that kind of core that is present in some of these people that makes it possible to do some of these heinous things and then go on and have a seemingly normal life. Also, John Wayne Gacy and David Parker Ray and some others had these double lives, right, Dr. Stone?
Yes, I mean, another thing that I mentioned to Tommy when I interviewed him is that I thought that of course he killed men and babies as well as women, but mostly women. And I said, Tommy, it seems to me like when I think about your history, it was as though you were in a psychological sort of a way. You were killing your mother over and over again, and there he got a little testy with me. And he said, "Anyone touch a hair of her head, I'll kill him in a minute." In other words, he immediately so as if loved his mother. The idea of wanting to kill his mother farthest thing from his mind, even though as you and I, as in the psychological field, we know damn well he was killing his mother over and over, as was even more so in a way Ridgway, because Ridgway had this beautiful, seductive, but absurd mother, who would make him stand naked in front of his brothers if he wet his bed. He was anuretic for quite a while, which shamed him. He had a double attitude about, he would go around wanting to be with one woman after the other, but at the same time he was killing his mother really over and over and over.
And Ridgway, has openly said, and by the way, I think it's important to point out one very interesting thing that Tommy Linsells and Gary Ridgway have in common is that both of them have been determined to have IQs in the low 80s,
right.
sort of at a borderline IQ. I think that is important to bear that in mind. They have that singularity. But in the case of Ridgway has openly said that he was very confused growing up because he found himself erotically attracted to his mother while also loathing her. So he would describe, for instance, that when he wet his bed, his mother would take him, and wash him in his private areas and so forth. And he was disturbed at how much he was enjoying that at the same time that he was mortified. You see the same confusion of the mother as an erotic object versus an object of hatred in Tommy Linsells, who was thrown out of the house originally because he tried to get into the shower with his mother, when she was nude, and that sort of aroused him. He later, when there was an attempt at a reconciliation, he tried to get into bed with his grandmother, and he was thrown out of the house again. So it's a kind of an interesting thing, that confusion, and we see it to such an extreme. For example, if you remember from the book, we sort of we say that we feel that the very top of Category 22, the worst of the worst, the creme de la creme, I suppose, he was what would be David Parker Ray. I think it's incontrovertibly, about as bad as it gets. And you'll see in that case that he would have a woman that he idealized, that he would have slaves, people they were picking up and turning into slaves, call a mistress, and she would be treated like a sort of a perfect golden, and whereas this other person was being subjected to the most heinous imaginable sadistic torture. And I remember I read in one of the biographies that I was very struck by it, was that there was one witness, she said, one survivor, who said that Ray sat her down and said, "You're such a nice woman. If I had known that you were that kind of a woman, I would have never brought you here and done these things to you." So I think we really have to understand and grasp that concept of splitting, and I think it's also present in the way we react to these killers and the sort of walking away from them confused about why we can like them, and at the same time that we sort of want them dead.
I'd love to go back to your new book. So previously we talked about Dr. Stone introducing his scale in the anatomy of evil. And now you have this new book, The New Evil, out, revisiting the scale and elaborating on it. And what I found really interesting is how much Gary Ridgway and Tommy Linsells may have in common, yet they're so many points away from each other on the scale. So I know Tommy Linsells is a 22, and am I correct that Gary Ridgway falls at category 18?
Yes, I think 18 would be an excellent and astute placement of him. Yes, and the reason is that you need a little bit of non-protracted torture in addition to repeat homicide to be in category 18. And what we see in Ridgway, sort of like we see in Ted Bundy, is what we would call non-protracted torture. Strangulating someone with a ligature, so forth. In the case of Bundy, we saw some biting and some kind of cruel, treatment like that. With Sells, there was the use of methods of murder that really led to a kind of a sadistically prolonged, cruel death. I mean, for example, I remember Dr. Stone's interview very intimately. I watched it a couple of times when I was writing, and I remember that he said to him, "Why did you kill the children? I can understand you, going in killing a mother. Why did you kill the children?" He said, "Well, I didn't want them to go through the pain, of being without their parents." And so Dr. Stone said to him, well then, why didn't you kill them with a gun? Why did you have to beat them with a baseball bat or something like that, whatever?" And he said, "Well, I don't like guns. They're dangerous."
I saw that. I heard that.
Right. You remember, Dr. Stone, that ridiculous answer that you, yeah. But there was definitely this sadistic prolongation of, and just the sheer butchery, which became so expansive that it ultimately came to encompass entire families, which I think had more than a hint of envy in it, of people who had intact families and loving families. But with Ridgway, what you're seeing is just repeat murder with, you don't have that prolongation. Death was fairly expedient, and that most of this kind of sexual gratification was coming from, that sort of quick killing and then the necrophilic act.
You're pointing out something that's important on both sides of the divide here. Tommy, in effect, was killing the good mom that he didn't really have, whereas Ridgway was killing the whore mother that he had a mother who was both a conventional woman, with her family, and he himself worked 30 years at this paint job that he had. He would get under the neighbor's car, he was very good mechanically, despite his modest IQ, and would be very neighborly and fix things. But the part of him that and unconsciously was aware of the mother as being whorish, with the seductiveness that she, how she behaved toward him. That's what led him to not so much go after nice moms and nice families like Sells, but rather prostitutes, one after the other, all the way up to 70.
It's kind of interesting because the way that you see these patterns that I think have some real use in terms of understanding motivations and patterns and habits in people that commit crimes similarly. And I think, as the scale sort of gets more and more popular and penetrates the general public, I think you're starting to see more people getting interested in research where these get turned into distinct profiles that allow us to have insight. And Michael and I have been working, for example, with Ann Burgess. You may know they based the character on Mindhunter on Netflix on her. We've been working with her to expand these categories, for instance, to look at motivations for acts like dismemberment and mutilation, which, as you probably remember from the book, are complicated because they can be driven by all the same distinct motivations we see throughout the scale. It's because when people hear about something as heinous as that, they immediately say, "You must be high on the scale." But that's not necessarily true. We see dismemberment and mutilation in all kinds of cases, from someone who has an explosion of rage and has no psychopathic features to someone who is doing it just to get rid of a body, someone they've impulsively killed, to cannibalism, to keeping body parts for trophies, for sexual reasons. So it's sort of becoming a basis for a lot of really interesting research, I think. And
you said something earlier I'd love to circle back to, and that is how Gary Ridgway and Tommy Lynn Sells both kind of were in the lower end of intelligence. And I find it interesting looking at Ridgway's case. I often feel like maybe he's underestimated because he spent a lot of time ruining the crime scenes, putting other people's DNA there, posing these corpses to kind of allude to more than there was for the police and getting them confused. What do you think about that? Have you guys thought anything that maybe he is more intelligent than people claim?
Well, it's hard, even with respect to Tommy Lynn Sells, who his score of 82 is like borderline, subnormal intelligence, but he had so little schooling, and no one was reading him bedtime stories, and he didn't have, the ordinary people, the lucky people, build up a huge vocabulary by the time they're 3, from all of the 3 million words that they've heard from their folks and other people. in those first few years, whereas people often in poverty backgrounds, they hear very few words. They have much more meager vocabulary, and so that when they take an IQ test, they come out not so well. But it may be that not genetically the problem so much as an environmental problem, that they weren't given the advantages that ordinary children are. From what we know of Ridgway, he wasn't brutalized early and neglected in the way that Tommy Lynn Sells was. So he may be more authentically disadvantaged from the standpoint of intelligence. He had a brother, I think, by a different father, who became a physicist. So the chances are the disparity between the IQ of him and his brother were quite large. The adaptive mechanisms that you could summon to get through life in a more socially appropriate way are more limited than in somebody who's very bright. That is not to say that there aren't some serial killers like Larry Bittaker, who has a very high IQ of 138, so that you can't say that IQ protects one from doing heinous things, but the higher the IQ, probably the greater likelihood that you could end up making an adaptive solution, to life's problems and get a good job and things like that than somebody who was disadvantaged.
It's important to remember, and as a psychologist, I've had to do a lot of IQ testing in my day, and I can tell you that what they're sort of leaving out when you hear the IQ of someone like this is they're not telling you whether the IQ was valid, because it would have to show a reasonable distinction between the visual and verbal skills. And what happens is that if there's a wide enough disparity between those skills, we wouldn't even consider the IQ valid. I think what you see in a lot of these people is that there's probably a scatter of scores where they were not particularly, just like Dr. Snow was saying, they're not particularly verbally adept. As a matter of fact, I participated in some research at a hospital where we found that people who had lower verbal IQs or lower verbal ability were more likely to be explosive and full of rage because they can't get their feelings out. They can't talk down their rage. And it's kind of interesting that, what we may be seeing is that in terms of visual ability, if we think of the person almost like with an incredible, sort of like visual capacity, we think of them almost like a tiger or something, that has this ability to see, but no ability to talk. It's you see somebody with this pure visual strength, then it will bring the IQ down, and they'll wind up looking like a very unintelligent person. But I think that in both cases you actually saw some removal of evidence and so forth. Tommy Lynn Sells, for instance, the last crime where he cut the sleeping girl's throat while the other girl was in the same room and so forth. After that, he tried to clean it up. He was walking. In fact, when the police found him, he was walking away with the screen that he had removed from the window, and was concerned about fingerprints. And certainly, Gary Ridgway went much further in terms of concealing. If I remember, he even did things like bring a body across state lines and sort of move bodies around and so forth, so that police would be confused about what happened. And I think I would be very surprised if Gary Ridgway did not learn a lot of that stuff about the police techniques and so forth from reading about or viewing things about other killers and police techniques. I mean, Edmund Kemper, for instance, has spoken another very intelligent person, has spoken very eloquently about how he learned a lot of this stuff from watching television, talking to cops, and reading magazines. And so we don't know how much Ridgway was just sort of mimicking or parroting techniques and things that he learned. We just don't know, because it's an unsophisticated IQ test to just say this is somebody's IQ. We need the details.
So before we let you guys go, we know you've got a busy day ahead of you. Real quick, each of you, the most unsettling person. You said you had to interview a lot of people to make your books. The most unsettling psychopath that you encountered.
Who do we find to be the most horrendous?
Or just like in your interactions that really kind of made the hair stand up on the back of your head. Top person, just the name.
Who gets that dubious distinction, right, of being the most horrendous of the horrendous? Well,
Well, I think David Parker Ray is a standard because he killed, he tortured and killed more people, more women. In other words, there's a few people like John Ray Weber in Wisconsin.
Oh, Lord,
who did
yes.
horrendous, terrible things, to his sister-in-law and another woman, butchering them while they were still alive, and unspeakable things that he did. But he had very few victims, whereas David Parker Ray really made a study of it. He was like a professional sadistic torturer, in addition to being a park ranger and an artist and everything else he could do. He had many gifts, but the worst of them was, of course, luring women, to the toy box, where he would then hoist them up, and so they would be powerless. Read them this many page long document that he fashioned of all the horrible things that were about to happen to them. It's unimaginable.
Well, because, it became clear to me, even with all the training I had prior to getting into crime as a subject, that what you really need is a confluence of three factors. I mean, to really be what we would call evil, to do evil things. The most evil in the crime will involve psychopathy, sadism, and I think a kind of a mechanical detachment from reality. That's a point Dr. Stone has made over the years, and I think is a great insight. And you see all of that in David Parker Ray. You see the psychopathy, across his life. We see an individual who had a relentless sexual appetite that oddly didn't burn out even when he was older. And then we had this extreme degree of sadism beyond anything I have ever seen before. And then finally, there was this ability to view people almost as if they were machinery or an object, where he had an intellectual curiosity about what happens if I do this to this part of the body. What happens if, and you see that in the category 22 people. I made a point of saying in part one of the book there that I was struck by that every case we picked, just randomly picked to write about, with the exception of Tommy Linsells, or the lower IQ, they were all collectors. They were all people who had an intense intellectual curiosity. Robert Berdella, for instance, treated bodies like they were like frogs on a dissection table. Who was interested in things like, what happens if I put Drano in this individual's eyes? What happens if I put caulk into their ears? What happens if I tie this piano wire around their hands? And we see Gary Heidnik was certainly a collector. First of all, he collected paper money and coins and things like that, but he also collected people. And Robert Berdella ran an antique shop where he sold his collectibles. John Wayne Gacy was a collector of both people and artwork. And and I have to tell you that if I could make a prediction, I think when we look into this, we are going to find that IQ is related to the intellectual stimulation and the mechanical detachment that we see in people at the highest end of the scale. I'm interested in that question of whether that takes a kind of a combination of intelligence, schizoid detachment, and kind of a psychopathic, sadistic quality. And you may need the need for intellectual stimulation to do some of that stuff, which seems to me to be more important than the sexual aspect of these people. So, but I hope this has been insightful and interesting to you guys.
Yeah, it absolutely has. And I know it's dark information, but it's been a delight to have you on with us today. So I really appreciate you spending time with us.
So just so all your listeners know, the book is called The New Evil, Understanding the Emergence of Modern Violent Crime. It was put out by Prometheus Books in March of this year, and it's doing quite well. And we hope that more and more people will discover it and take an interest in our insights.
Absolutely, I can vouch for it. It was really good. You guys obviously are academics, but it is written in a way that's going to be interesting to everybody. I thought it was great.
Well, I appreciate it.
Thank you. Have a great day.
All right. Well, thank you very much.
Yeah.
The title of Dr. Bricado and Dr. Stone's new book is The New Evil, Understanding the Emergence of Modern Violent Crime. We will have a link up on our website so that you can go purchase the book on Amazon. There are multiple formats of the book, whether you're a listener, digital reader, or old school page turner, so you must check it out. I'll be fine. They're fine.
We're fine.
I'm
Everyone's
fine.
fine.
Okay,
We're fine.
So hard words.
Do some for your big, beautiful lips.
They're not big. They're medium.
They're still beautiful.
Thanks.
Was that a kiss?
It's been a long while.
You must always say thank you after a kiss, right? Thanks.
I'm so sorry. What? Right. So I
Who had a relentless sexual appetite that oddly didn't burn out, even when he was older.
lucky.
The order?
I'm just thinking.
Oh.
Just let me
Oh,
think.
okay.
Fucking let me think. I know it's not that common, but like, just let me think.
Everyone seems a little edgy today.
Okay.
Would you like to write it down?
No.
One take Susan.
That's not happening today. Visit our website. Sorry about that.
Mamma mia.
No, it's the heat, and then the season's changing, and the clouds and the temperature changing. Like, I just have sinus stuff running down my throat constantly. Also, you can find me on Tinder, Bumble, and OkCupid.
No, it's great
Serious
because you
things.
can talk to anyone without having to swipe on them.
It's just like life.
Coupon codes and information about your hosts. Fuck. Be sure to check out our website. This feels like when you're setting your voicemail, and like I cannot set a voicemail, and I do it in another room by myself. Hi, I don't know my name because people are looking at me, and this feels weird. For all sorts of additional information, including coupon codes, fuck, don't tell me to write it down because that's what you're about to do, and I don't want to. Be sure to check out our website, murderintherain.com, for additional information on all cases.
Mm-hmm.
I know.
Can you take that deep sigh again, please?
Fine, then write it down.
Okay.
Review us on iTunes or wherever you listen to us.
Review us.
Oh,
My existence is meaningless.
Stop, Porter.
I know. That's a derogatory term.
I know. That's why I said it like that. Anyway, we met girls in a cab who ended up going with us. They were so drunk, and one spit on my face and made me dance, and I don't like touching strangers. Fuck yeah! Fuck yeah!
Murder in the Rain is produced and edited by Josh McCullough. Written and hosted by Emily Rowney and Alicia Holland. Artwork by Jamie Costa. Music by Kai Pfeiffer at kyfifer.com. Check out our website, murderintherain.com, for additional information on all cases, a fun interactive map, and be sure to subscribe so you can receive our newsletter. Check out the Mad Props page for coupon codes from some of our sponsors. We love your reviews and seeing them on all streaming platforms, especially iTunes. And check us out on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. And suck my balls.
Please put that in.